we've got 8 speakers. We've got at least 2 local GM speakers that I can think of that have never spoken at the GM's conference before. So great to have new blood. As I do every year, I give a shout out to Jason Corley for creating the GM's conference. And to Brian Poe for continuing the GM's conference. He made it happen 3 years afterwards. So I walk in rather large, well, figuratively large footprints. Yeah, I'm a 12, so there you go. Anyway, 12-6E, baby. Anyway, so I'm about to give instructions that I haven't had to do since I had an interview podcast. And that is, these are dynamic microphones. That means the closer you get your face to them, the better you're going to sound when you talk into them. So just to, because if I talk from here, you can still hear me because I have a big mouth. But if I get closer here,
it actually comes out.
Exactly. So just think about it. We're going to have PowerPoint presentations for many of these, just because, you know, it's cool to have something to look at sometimes. And we're going to get started. And I, of course, walked away from my phone where I have everything on here. Again, with 8 presentations. So the GM's conference is great because every GM worth their salt is trying to get better, in my opinion. Like every time you run a game, you tend to think about what you did right, you know, what you might have done wrong, what you could just tweak a little bit to do better. It is one thing to try to get player feedback, which is often like pulling teeth. And when it does come, it's often like with, you know, 1 to 2 years of pent-up frustration with some shit they never told you that you were doing wrong. So the GM's conference is great because you get to sit down with your peers and share ideas, hopefully come home with at least one thing for your toolbox, and we all get better together. So I'm going to bring up our first speaker. This gentleman started out doing a popular YouTube show called Drunkens and Dragons, and gained quite a following with his like super simple style of running like his Dungeons and Dragons, and it snowballed into a game called the Index Card RPG. He intelligently rebranded to Runehammer Games, and it's really been snowballing and getting amazing. Index Card RPG has a huge following that's only growing, has a phenomenal way of running that standard classic D&D that is easy on the GM but maintains all the feel. You should definitely check it out. And Brandish Gilhelm is going to come down and he's going to talk about something that's straight out of the Index Card RPG, timers, threats, and treats. Give him a round of applause.
Happen.
Oh, I have to make the magic happen.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Let's make the magic happen. Thanks for braving your sleep deprivation and hangover. Yeah. If you have either or both, hello.
Yes.
So yeah, thanks for the nice intro. That's cool.
Yeah, all you have to do is arrow forward on the keyboard.
Great. So frog people are people too. That's the pronoun I identify with. Frog. Okay, so my thing, so what are we doing? Oh, right. So we want to get better. Yeah, and then Ron mentioned my game, which kind of took, like, I don't know if you guys know some of my stuff, but I live in this crazy world of 3D terrain and all this kind of stuff, which some of us do. Like, you wind up making, like, loads of artistic things. And, I don't know, quite a while back, I saw Adam Coble in a video, like, way back before anybody knew who he was, and he's, like, doing this thing where he wrote dragon on an index card. He put it over here, and then he drew this crappy like triangle, and it said mountain. And he like put it over here, and they played their game session. And it was really awesome, and something about that like not only reminded me of how dumb my sort of style is, but was even simpler. It was like even crazier how simple. So that sort of got me a brainworm going, and then that became this book, Index Card RPG, and so on and so forth. And now I'm like one of the top 50 publishers of all time on drive-thru, so that's weird. So it really worked. So that's my sort of pseudo credential there. But anyway, so what I want to talk about is probably one of the most sort of sticky parts of that game system, which is, I think in like these sort of boxes or blobs, and I often call them rooms. So when I say the word room over and over, you'll hear me say that a lot. It doesn't necessarily mean like this room. Like the Pelennor Fields could be a room. So like anything in my brain is a room. It's just a nice 4-letter word that's kind of got some symmetry and looks cool. So when I say room, that's what I'm talking about. So when I think about rooms, I came up with this kind of goofy thing. I have all these dumb acronyms that I do. And one of them is the 3 T's, which are timers, threats, and treats. So that was my talk today about how to like get better at what we're doing. So I just wanted to, I don't know, talk about it. That's what we do, right? That's what we're here for. That's why I'm in the desert. Okay, timers, threats, and treats. This is a title page. Okay, so we're moving on to the timers. Okay, so with timers, you guys can probably already tell already, I'm like very kind of like insectoid kind of person. So I'm constantly bored with everything. So even when I totally succeed at something, or like everybody's laughing and drinking beer, and we're all having a great time, I'm instantly bored with it. That sounds kind of mean. I didn't mean it that way, but you know what I mean. I always want the next thing to happen. Like, I love Knight Rider, but God, the story moves so slow. So anyways, timers are how I started like pressing my players to be more interesting and keep moving forward. So I have this funny reputation online of like hating town. So this is typical of me, is I did the last bullet first. Oh God, we're in town. So I often found that when I was a player, especially in D&D, we'd be in town and I would just be gouging my eyes out, just like, what are we doing? Like, well, I don't know what we're doing. Honestly, even the people who were role-playing didn't know what they were doing. But so I started wanting to, as GM, I started wanting to put a timer even on things like town. So this became a much bigger idea, and then eventually it found its way into the sort of the D4, which is kind of where I kind of got my skimpy notoriety for this, which is like, you just roll out this D4, and in the beginning I used to call it a suspense die. And the players wouldn't know what it was, but I would be like, in this many rounds, it's happening. And they'd be like, what's happening? I don't know yet, but it's going to be crazy. And so sometimes it would be 1, and they would be like, no. And other times it's 4, and so there's kind of a moment when, people go get a snack. Because 4 rounds is forever in any game. And so that's how it all began. But then in time, the timers became far more nuanced and fascinating. And then, thanks to people like Victor and Dave and others, the timers became multifaceted. So there would be multiple ones on a board at any one time. There would even be entire games that would be timed. I think we had a run of the Red Sword, which is my sort of spaceship game that's in the book, where the whole game is on a timer. So you either make it in like 8 rounds or 12 rounds, or you blow up in space. It's like super simple. And it started really growing. So anyways, my advice, or my sort of thesis here for how to get a little better as a GM, is that you use these timers to constantly press your game. And it's kind of like exactly what you don't want to do at a party. Like if you like go to a kegger party or something, you don't want to like pressure everyone to get to the end of the party. Like you kind of want time to stand still and party forever. But when I'm playing D&D, I always want to get to the next thing. And I bet if all you guys are GMs, which I imagine you are, you know this feeling of just like, we've been in this lake for like 4 hours. And it's like, yeah, but we're floating on the Paladin, or whatever. You know what I mean? And it's just, I know it's funny and everything, but sometimes it's just like, oh. So when you're floating on the Paladin out in the lake, then, you throw down your D4, and in that many rounds, like a Gargaleth is going to come out and start, screwing with everybody. And so the question that becomes interesting isn't like, am I going to use a timer? The question becomes interesting is like, what are they? And the easiest answer is imminent dooms, and I bet the one that you've all done is like lava. The room is filling with lava. So you only have X time to, you know, grab the sacred helmet and ride the paladin out on a wave of lava. So that's the easy one, is like imminent doom. It's like infinitely useful. And so those of you who have had the unfortunate experience of playing in my games know that every single thing basically has like imminent doom. I just don't care anymore. I'm embracing it. So it's like, even if you're like haggling over the price of, you know, like a suit of scale mail, you know, there's like a house elf who's about to like light the place on fire or whatever. That was a really weird example. That got strange. Like a labor uprising. So you better get the damn scale mail before the labor uprising happens. Okay, there we go. Now we got a scene. So between the use of the suspense die is like the way to troll your players. It's like something's gonna happen, guys. So that's how it all begins. That's the most formless way to do it. And then you let the players, like one of them will accidentally admit their darkest fear, and then that's what's gonna happen. But the imminent doom is the more sort of common way to just like, come on guys, let's okay, row the paladin across the lake. Come on, let's do this. And then the biggest one, and I think when you really started to master the art of doing timers, is when you can do them in town. And that's when you really got it down pat, and you can have a town session in the middle of a session, which is like mind-blowing. So imagine like doing a little bit of action, then you go to town to like repair your gear and buy some bear jerky or whatever. and the whole town experience only takes like 20 minutes. What? And then you get to go back into the dungeon or back to the next location. And to me, that's when you've got really like got your timers down pat. Is when you have even something completely formless like town still moves in like, you guys have time because of X to do one thing in town. So what are you gonna do? Blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, the labor uprising takes over and prices on bear jerky are very high. What are you gonna do? We're gonna add a location device to the paladin's armor when he's not looking. that sounded really pre-written, but honestly it wasn't. Okay, so that's my first piece, is timers. So every room that you create, remember room is a big abstract concept. Every room you create has a timer. And the way that you force yourself to do this, creatively speaking, is that when you're bulleting your journal or you're doing your prep, however, whatever strange ritual you perform in the darkness by yourself, you have 3 bullets on any given space, and they're timer, threat, and treat, and it forces you to fill those in. And that's a good way to sort of punch your creative brain in the face and be like, function! Because I don't know about you guys, but I just like never have ideas. So I always have to use like sort of mnemonic devices to eye poke myself to be creative. So,
Floating paladin is pretty cool though.
first one, yeah, let's go on the bucket list. They're all looking at each other like, this is the best time of our life. This is the most buoyant paladin I've ever been in a party with. And he's just like, whoa. I have to ride him face down. I mean, that's...
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that again got a little strange. Okay, so first you're gonna write down a timer. You can also have a timer that, like, paladin can only hold his breath so long. Wow. So next we're gonna move to threats. Here we have a drow archer with a cat. So for threats, this is the more easy one, and this is one that like all of you guys are probably used to. So every room that you do, there needs to be something bad. Now, the obvious answer is monsters. So whenever you're in the, you know, command room of a spaceship, a derelict spaceship, there's always a formless monstrosity creeping out of the air vents, right? I mean, they're just, there it is. Of course there is. And there's a dwarf with goggles. I mean, so that's the easy answer. So all of us do that. So a lot of us go into a room, and there's a brief moment where players are creeping about, and then they're like missing their perception rolls, so they have no idea what's happening. And then one guy just does this anyways. And then there's monsters. So that's really easy. Then you have your timer compounded upon that, and suddenly you have an interesting 2-axis chart. So here comes time, and then here is the threat. And when they meet is the most exciting part of that room. So it gets more interesting now when you realize the bigger threats, because monsters are eliminatable, as you guys all know. Unless you're like a real troll like I am, like last night.
Or you have my dice.
Where you have invincible enemies. So we did a game last night where I literally have these 2 guards that are called the Invincibles. And it takes like an hour for the players to just fully psychologically accept they can't be hurt. You cannot hurt them. I'm sorry. It's written, it's right here. I didn't make this up. Well, I made it up, but I made it up. I didn't just make it up. Somehow that makes it more, there's more veracity there. Okay, anyway. So what gets interesting beyond the monsters is your environment is the non-destroyable enemy. And this can be your threat, and sometimes it can be the best threat. So again, to kind of play on our game last night, we did have a lake of slime. I mean, it is D&D after all. And you can't destroy the lake of slime. And it's between what you and you want, between you and what you want. So it's actually my best threat in that room because you can sink in it and you don't breathe, and like enemies are more used to it than you are, and you can lose gear in there, stuff like that. So my threat becomes this static thing that you can never beat. And this gets more interesting. Now, you don't always want to just be like, there's an asteroid attacking you. And that's just being an a-hole. But your environment is your best monster because A, it can never be destroyed, and B, it's always interesting and weird to be working against the environment. I mean, Jack London, proof. So, when you get the handle on this, then your monsters and your evil environment, they start to work together maybe. And this is, again, like last night, we had these sort of things that live in this black slime, and they can kind of disappear into it and all this stuff, and they become a team. And finally, this is save versus everything, is sort of this is, again, when you've fully mastered the art of, like, the threat in the room, is that there is no danger in this world that is irrelevant. Everything that is happening can be saved against. And so, this is kind of like backdraft. Okay, even in Backdraft, when that whole thing happens, there's and it goes up against the door, and then like Matt Damon or whoever the hell's in that movie is like, look out! That even though the whole place becomes a threat at that moment, like the fire becomes the monster in a way. It's non-destroyable, it's infinite, it's huge, it's super deadly. There's always a little bit of a chance that you can jump behind Matt Damon. Me too. I'm cutting it right there. It doesn't get any better than that. And he's the paladin, by the way. In this film, he plays the paladin. Okay, so now you have time. So you're not getting boring, formless morass in your game anymore, because there's a sense of time. Now you're gonna have mixed success with it. It's not like you can just put an egg timer in front of a player and just be like, oops, you're dead. Bell went off. Do that. Although that'd be cool too. So you have time, so you're at least starting to solve the problem of the morass, which to me was my biggest hurdle of really liking D&D over the years, is that I had a few games that I played maybe a decade ago where that's all we did was the morass. Now sometimes it's like hilarious and awesome, but if your liver's starting to tire a little bit, then the formlessness can be a little frustrating. So you have that with timers. You have threats, which is like, remember, you're bulleting, so you're forcing your brain to make creative rooms. So you have monsters, and then you're like, ooh, I can do better than monsters. I can have an air leak. And the air leak is not only a threat, because having no air sucks, it's also sort of a timer in itself, and like, whoa, okay, I'm getting cross-axis coolness and all that stuff. So now the final piece is on the opposite side, because all those things are things that make you get hurt, make you die. But treats are the opposite. Treats are things you want, like warlock art. I don't know. Matt Damon as the warlock. Okay, so the function of a treat is to lure people. In this case, the treat is an otter creature, or maybe a weasel of some kind, a ferret, and you're apparently a cave roper who's going to cross this cave to get the ferret. So, this is PowerPoint, guys. So the idea of a treat is that every room needs to have a reason to cross it. And so again, room is abstract concept, so you have to kind of work with me a little bit here. But you need something that's like, over here, right? And that causes the timer to be interesting, that causes the monsters to be between, me and my sandwich. I really want my frickin' sandwich, and there's cave ropers. And so that's why I go through. Now, a lot of times there's an implied treat in D&D, which is like progress. And it works sometimes, but I think all of us in this room have probably been playing for at least a decade or so, and I do think it wears thin. Kind of like, well, we want to see the next room, right? And I'm just like, so tired, need to do taxes. So I think in time you really need like a limbic hook on people to lure them through rooms. Limbic meaning, emotional, like, and a lot of times these take funny forms. And so these are the 3 most proven treats that I've used in my games over the years, so I wanted to share them. And the first one is to get heals. So like, if your games are anything like mine, everyone always has 1 hit point. Or maybe 2 because they're the paladin. We're paladin, man. So anyways, paladin has 2 hit points, everybody else has 1, no spells left, and then you see a bush over there with like some glowing berries in it. So the glowing berries are obviously healing berries, and between you and them are, you know, rabid ferrets, or whatever. And so you have to be like, you know. So that's the easiest one, is like, the world's gonna heal you if you get over there. And since no one has any heals, and no one has any heal potions, and like, hit points are hard to come by, which is a whole other part of your game that I think you need to master. It's like, you know, you can't be having these huge feelings of invincibility with your players. Like, fear is your commodity is another sort of saying I'm known for. As a GM, like, fear is what you sell. So, anyways, if they're not afraid, they're not going to be so tantalized by heals. But in my games, like, any form of healing is a massive motivator. And you'll even have like people using jump spells and stuff like to get to the healing. So that's a pretty easy one. So you just get a few tropes going for like, what do heals look like in your world? I always have a bush with glowing berries. Maybe there's a potion on a little stand. Maybe there's like a fountain, you know, a little angel, little Zelda fountain. Second one, obviously, is freaking loot. So Peter, I think last night discovered in my games how like upfront I am about this. It's like, yeah, there's a freaking backpack with sparklies in it. Like sparkly what? I don't know. We'll figure that out in a minute. Yeah, and then there's just like a chest. It's just a freaking treasure chest. I know it's as old as time itself. But it gets a limbic hook in people, and I think to make the creative sacrifice of like, I'm such a brilliant GM, I have a cooler idea than a chest. To sacrifice that in the name of a limbic hook, which I know it worked on you last night, of just like, there's a chest, I'm just gonna kind of, hey, whoa, yeah. You know, it works, it just works, especially if you keep loot low in your group, like you destroy their loot constantly. Take the loot away, they drop it, it gets melted, it gets stolen, it gets rammed in their head, whatever. But they need loot so bad, and honestly, the drive for loot is stronger than the drive for heals. Honestly, the drive for loot is sometimes stronger than the drive for like companionship. People will be like, this guy's dying over here, hang on a second. Shit. It's bear jerky. Okay, so that's loot, and then finally is the ultra classic. And this one, I think, is probably the strongest one, maybe, is to see doors in rooms. In my experience, I don't know about you guys, but players cannot stand a door that's just sitting there. There's something about it that just twists a nail in their face. And so, I guess what that instructionally says to you is when you're doing this room, you need this door. So let's take a difficult example like the Pelennor Fields. The door is like the front gate of Minas Tirith, right? And it's kind of like, we're all screwed, and we're out here in the open, and Nazgul, and all this shit. Oh, cool, look, it's Gandalf. And the real treat there is not Gandalf. The treat is getting back into Minas Tirith. And you have this limbic feeling of like, if we get in there, the Nazgul are screwed, we got catapults, and shit's gonna be awesome. And that like feeling, that is the treat. And so in a lot of rooms, there's, and this is where you can really be an a-hole, is the door seems like we're done with this part, and we did it. But in fact, it's just a door to another lake of slime. But it works really, really good. And then, just like everything else, when you get the cross-axis is when you get the cool stuff. So when you have the loot in the door, is sort of a trope that I've seen a lot of times. You have a chest that's sort of in an archway, and you just get this, like, you know, player drool that makes no sense. It's like a sort of a 4th grade level impulse. You know? And you want that. Whereas heals are a little more practical. So your challenge as a GM then is to take the idea of a door and play and create something new. And so another like term that I like to think of it as is like thinking of your game like a water slide. And there's a part where your players are standing there going like, I don't know if I'm tall enough for this ride. And then they kind of get in there, and once they're sliding, they're just freaking sliding. And the door isn't necessarily something I need to go over and like turn the handle and like, hey. It's more just like when you know, you guys ever do the water slide where it like changes colors? It's like blue for the first part, and then it's like orange all of a sudden, and it's like a super thrill. That to me is a door. It's very simple. It's just like, you know, you got your potato chips on one side, and you're like, I don't know, jelly beans on the other side. And between them is the door. And so sometimes just that relief of theme is a treat. Like, God, we've been in the jungle for so effing long. And then in the distance, you see there's a clearing and there's like a stone floor, like in Land of the Lost. Remember that? They like, the first 6 episodes, they're just fucking around in the jungle. And then they finally see like cobblestones. They're just like, oh my God, it's amazing. Yeah, and so they got to go over there and look around, and then there's 3 stacks, and then second season gets weird. That got a little too specific, sorry about that. That was a cool show though, that was alright. The claymation was kind of dope. Alright, so anyway, so there you have these 3 axes, and this is where you can get not only your 3 bullets, but if you sort of think in calculus a little bit, sorry about that, then you can see where those axes cross become the interesting parts of your adventure, is where the timers, the threats, and the treats are not only creating pull and like limbic fun in your game, but there are moments when they actually intersect. When your treat is the sort of location of your threat, and your timer is based upon that theme. And one of these could be our sort of paladin boat. To try to take a very difficult example and play with it, is the timer is how long the paladin can hold his breath. The threat is, you know, like the paladin is like screaming the whole time and no one can hear him, that there are like tentacles coming up. You know, and then the treat is that you're riding on a paladin. The tree would have to be somewhere ahead. The tree is the shore. And the shore is not just a shore, it's like, you know, they're like, I don't know, Tahitian women with like palm fronds. So like, this is getting really strange. But anyways, there's a very promising shore, and that's your thing. And so there's going to be a moment when you're 1 turn from shore, you're 1 turn from the paladin running out of breathing, the tentacles are already up, like you have all of these axes come together, and that's going to be the moment when your room is like at its hell yeah moment. And you'll build to that, and then you'll slide off the back end. And that sense of sort of music is what I think makes a great adventure. So each room has that little piece of music. And if you have enough of that over the course of a night, maybe 3 or 4 movements, like to follow sort of box kind of aesthetics, then you have like a nice little sort of piece of symphony. It's so heady, man. That's it. I'm done. So just, you know, never look down on frogs, because they were lizards once, just like us. I don't know what I'm doing.
No, just put it down.
Okay. I didn't mean with microphone.
Just in general.
All right, so I have seen quite a bit of Drunkards and Dragons, and I said, you know, who could follow that awesome, frenetic style? And I thought to myself, a lawyer would be perfect. So, next up, we have a local game master. He's a freelance writer and designer himself, even though he makes fun of designers. It's self-deprecating, I guess, at the end of the day. He's also the creator of the Game Masters Conference, and he will be discussing the morality of fantasy worlds. Jason Corley, everybody.
So,
Hang on a second. Your thing.
oh, thanks.
So I want to talk a little bit about how I came to be interested in this. I got a philosophy degree when I was in college years ago. It was really interesting and really cool, and I definitely recommend the study of philosophy to pretty much everybody, and if you can find the time. It's just very interesting. And then the other inspiration was the Japanese video game Persona 5, which I began to play very late this year, and it inspired in me just sort of an analysis of some of the things that have worked in my games in the past and some of the things that haven't, some of the things in the worlds that are presented in games and the worlds that we create for our campaigns. I think one of the key elements in fantasy isn't the presence or absence of magic, but instead it is the ability to directly confront evil. In our real world, if there's an evil, oftentimes it comes about as a result of a system. You can't just punch a guy and have the evil be defeated. You can't go to some overlord and get rid of them and have the problems that overlord created disappear. In fantasy, you can. And that's what makes fantasy fantasy, more than the presence of magic. Superheroes are fantasies. Iron Man, is a fantasy, even though he gets his abilities from supposedly what is in the world is defined as science. But really what he's doing is when he goes and he punches Obadiah Stane in his power armor, he is directly confronting evil. And that's what makes Iron Man a fantasy just as much as a sword and sorcery story or Dungeons and Dragons. What was inspiring to me about Persona 5 was that it had a clear picture of morality, and it presented the morality first before the fantasy. In Persona 5, the opening incident is your main character sees a woman being abused on the street. He steps in, he intervenes. But the man who is doing the abuse is powerful and influential. So when the police arrive, they blame you. And the man is powerful and influential, so the woman is so afraid that when the police question her, she blames you. So this is the injustice of that is what makes your character go through all of the things that you go through in that game. And as a result, you find yourself in many variations of a situation where something bad is happening and you have to step in, you have to intervene. And people who intervene in abuse are the sort of moral center of the Persona world. So I wanted to, and that made it for a very effective story. So what I want to encourage and what I want to talk about today is the morals of fantasy worlds that we create or find in published games or that we create ourselves at our tables. And somewhat ironically, I don't want to talk about alignment. It's one of the clearest and most well-known sort of fantasy morality statements that's out there. But I think both people try to make too much of it and too little of it. So I'm just going to put a pin in that for now, and if we have time at the end, I'll come back and talk a little bit about alignment. But I want to just talk more broadly about the types of stories and campaigns that we can create together. So I want to start with sort of the classic fantasy of the English-speaking world, which is Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. We've had several attempts at Lord of the Rings role-playing games, Middle-earth role-playing back in the 80s. We have the One Ring now, each of which has their own sort of take on morality. But I just want to quickly ask here, can everyone just quickly raise your hand? Have you read the Lord of the Rings books or seen the movies? Yeah, it's pretty ubiquitous among gamers. So can someone tell me what makes Sauron evil? Why is Sauron bad?
His will to dominate all life.
His will to dominate all life. Great. And how does the Lord of the Rings series show us that the will to dominate all life is bad?
Because there's that scene where they're whipping Sam.
Okay,
And
so
the Shire's on fire. That was
right,
like,
you get a character that we love, and we see them suffer as a result of this will to dominate. Now, does Sauron come down and whip Sam personally? No, he sends his goons. What?
If you put on the ring, which is like putting on the clothes of Sauron, you want to dominate the whole world and abuse people.
Right, putting on this ring of power is an act that leads you to want to do those things. What I find interesting is that, and this was a choice that they put into the movies, and I think they even extended it further in the movies than they are in the books. There's plenty of really powerful beings in the Tolkien universe. Some of them are even like main characters of the story. But without that will to dominate, their power isn't seen in this universe as evil. You know, the elves in the books can do just incredible acts of magic. They can just, you know, reshape reality to a tremendous degree. And then when they ask, they're like, wow, how could you do that? They just kind of shrug, and it's like, yeah, that's what we do. We can do that. Like, it's so normal to them that they don't see it as an opportunity to dominate. It's not surprising that someone who wrote these books at the beginning of the 20th century in England would think that modesty is a virtue, and that being modest with your power and not lording it over others is a virtue. This is, you know, someone that went through World War I and was, you know, writing just after World War II, a lot of these books. And so you find that modesty and restraint are seen as virtues. What's like the dream of Sam and Frodo? Like throughout the entire series, they want to go home to the Shire, right? They want to put their feet up. They have newspapers in the Shire. Do you remember that? There are actually newspapers in the Shire. They want to read their newspaper, smoke their pipe, and have a cup of tea, because they are the fantasy of a British man from the early part of the 20th century. And it's because they aspire to this modest living that they become the storehouse of virtue that permits them to go all the way, to carry this tremendous power with them all the way to the crack of doom. So that's an example of a statement of morality, that hubris and mercilessness are what create evil. That tells you something about the types of heroes you're going to make. So if you have a Lord of the Rings type campaign, and you have a player who says, I'm going to make a guy who wants to like rule this kingdom and bring it to heel, right? That's great, but you also have a guy that is really going to be faced with the temptation to not just do the wrong thing, but to enter into that cosmic wrongness of pure evil that the ring represents. So if you want to have a classic good versus evil, you might want to talk to him about that and say, hey, you understand that your ambition is your flaw here, and that the way this world is set up, that ambition is going to put you to the test. And maybe the player will be like, yeah, that's what I want. Yeah, I really want to be tempted here. But maybe they're just like, ooh, I didn't think of that. You know, I just didn't, maybe someone who just has that fantasy in real life and wants to play it out in the game. You really want to match that world to what they're doing. So I do want to say, it's not quite the same to say that Sauron is evil because of his will to power. It's not the same as saying that your bad guy in a fantasy story shouldn't have a motivation. In fact, one of the failure states of fantasy is where the bad guy is bad just for no reason. Like, he has no internal desires or priorities that make him do those evil things. It's because his motivations and his priorities are wrong, or wrong by the lights of the game world. That's what creates the evil in him. It's hard to use the comic book examples because most of the main comic book entities have been possessed by these corporations that have used them for 80 years, and they've had many different meanings over that time. But one that jumps to my mind is Spider-Man. So Spider-Man has a pretty clear remit as to what's evil and what's good. In Spider-Man, self-centeredness is evil, and self-sacrifice is good. Like, that's the core Spider-Man story, right? When he, goes to his wrestling match as the great Spider-Man and leaves a mugger to proceed, it results in tremendous evil to the world. Not just suffering to him, but the death of someone who is a genuinely good person has major impact on the world.
Spoilers for 70 years.
Right. So and that's how you design your Spider-Man villains, right? So who is the Rhino? Well, he's a guy who has super strength that he gets from a rhino suit. Okay, fine. Fine, that's good. But what makes the rhino bad? Why is the rhino robbing this bank? It's because he's self-centered. He wants money. He's greedy. Like he's been hired to rob this bank, or he knows that this bank has some kind of wealth in it that he can put his hands on, right? And he doesn't care. He's got this super suit, man. He's gonna go and do it because he's self-centered. And then Spider-Man has the choice. So I've got this date with Gwen Stacy, but I hear the alarm bell ringing at the bank. Am I gonna not go to my date, or am I gonna, go save the people at the bank from the rhino? And what makes Spider-Man good is he decides to go help the people at the bank, even though it hurts his romantic desires. So, yeah.
And that's a really good example, because every time he is faced with that challenge, he's reminded of his own thing.
Exactly right. That challenge it relates to the origin of the character, essentially. So, go ahead.
I wanted to point out that the word, there's a Latin word, you probably might know this, for self-centeredness, which is called superbia, and that's what's translated as pride. When they say that pride is the most deadly sin, the self-centeredness is what you're talking about.
Right, yeah, that's a good point. And for those in the back, he said that there's a Latin word, superbia, that is sort of a combination of self-centeredness and pride. That's why pride is the goeth before a fall, and it's one of the more powerful of the deadly sins. Yeah, absolutely, good point. So, once you have that statement of morality in mind, like self-centeredness versus self-sacrifice, you can start to create characters that embody that contradiction, right? Your bad guys are going to be self-centered. You know, someone who has like a minor superpower, oh, they're a bad guy if they like try to kidnap a scientist in order to increase their own power, right? So that they can be in the big leagues. Like they're centered on themselves. Or or someone with a tremendous superpower that tries to not use it because he knows it will hurt people around him. That's a hero under those circumstances. Now there are times when we might look at a situation and say, oh, gosh, this guy has all this power. He can do a lot of good in the world. He's not doing anything with it. We in the real world might say that, because here in the real world we don't have a clear picture of what our morality is and should be, and the consequences of our actions aren't always clear. But in a fantasy world, you can have a strong organizing principle for your good guys and your bad guys by using a moral statement. I'd like to create together a fantasy scenario. Before we get to that, I want to put in one last caution. It's very easy, and how many people here, just raise your hands if you like politics. If you like politics, you think it's good, right? Yeah, there's a very small number, but it's out there,
Those
right?
two different things, like it and it's good.
Everybody's so, yeah, you like it or it's good. So yeah, it's important. Jim says it's important, right? And I think that's true. A lot of times, I think we as GMs see ourselves as we're selling a product. You're not going to find a lot of political boldness on the part of, say, a major corporation, because they don't want to offend people that don't share their politics. And so a lot of times you're not going to find people in that position having any but the most like boring, middle of the road, something that is going to really try to keep everybody happy with what they're saying. But when you create a fantasy world, when you create a morality and you express that morality through the values of the characters in that world, you are going to be making a political statement. And my challenge to you is to embrace that, is to think about what political statement you're making and embrace it. Interestingly, I have had good experiences creating worlds that embrace political philosophies and points of view that I don't have, that I simply don't share in real life. My go-to example is the game Spycraft, which is based on James Bond movies, action, espionage, and so on. In a James Bond movie, international cooperation and humanity bettering itself is strictly the realm of the bad guys. Right? Like there is simply no room in a James Bond world for people to gather together to make their communities better. Those are the bad guys in the James Bond world. James Bond is a world that indicates that virtue is protecting the status quo at all costs, including lying, disguise, infiltration, violence, even assassination and murder. Again, a British guy in the 1950s and early 60s wrote these. Like he's facing what he thinks is annihilation from a communist threat. So that's how he sees morality. He puts that in his fantasy story of James Bond. And I love James Bond stuff. I love the books, I love the movies, I love playing that stuff in games. But my Spycraft game got better when I embraced that political point of view and made it so that like the characters were the bulwark of the protection of humanity. And that if they didn't do what they were supposed to do, there was no government agency that was going to bail them out. It's their own boldness and even willingness to break the law and their own rules that made James Bond work. So I don't believe any of that stuff in real life. I really don't. I could talk about my point of view on foreign policy all day, but it would not be interesting. In a fantasy world, though, I need to embrace some political thought as to what the content of the game is going to be. And I have two examples that I want to, that I brought with me, and I'll just kind of show them to you. One of them is Spire, The City Must Fall. So this is reading from the back, a fantasy punk role-playing game of intrigue, subterfuge, and sedition. In this game, you are all dark elf freedom fighters. You occupy a mile-high underground city, and your city is under the control of surface elves who have invaded with their human mercenary partners and now control this city in an oppressive state. Okay? Everyone in this game is a drow freedom fighter, essentially. And so as a GM of the Spire, one of the things I have to do is think about what is an oppressive society? What makes this society's oppression bad? What are the mechanisms of this society's oppression? And what makes opposing that oppression good? Are there evil ways to oppose this oppression? Or can you, quote unquote, go too far? Or am I going to portray a universe where any action, no matter how dire, is supported in overthrowing these folks? That's a political statement on my part. One of the factions in the book actually is a set of drow who the main faction, the one that player characters supposedly always belong to. There's one that does go too far, like it is in the book that way. What I think is great about the Spire is it doesn't tell you what going too far means. It lets you, the GM and the players, like, have rumors and like whispers about what they've done. And by putting those into place, you can then establish sort of the boundaries of what you see as moral opposition to the oppression. It also asks you to create the psychology of the oppressors and those that are complicit in the oppression. Like, humans don't live very long. This oppressive society is only, from elven perspectives, been in place about, 75, 80 years. But that's like 2-3 generations for some of these humans, right? Like, some of these humans are growing up like, okay, I guess this is how it is, but boy, it just seems so strange, right? But the elves who were there when all of these things happened, they kind of have a different understanding of it. So it asks you to create the psychology of the oppression. And that's a political statement too. You need to think about, when you're running the Spire, what an oppressive society is and why these particular acts are evil. So that's the first one I want to bring up. The second one is called Urban Shadows. It's a traveler hack. We roll 2d6. But what's interesting about Urban Shadows, which is an urban fantasy game in which there are vampires and werewolves, and they have kind of a secret society within modern day America, is there is actually a mechanic called corruption. And it's actually not unusual to have corruption mechanics or mechanics about evil. But what Urban Shadows does is it attaches a sort of political element to that as well. Mark, what is corruption in Urban Shadows? Just speaking from.
I don't know.
You don't know? It's just whatever GM wants it to do.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I want to say too much, because I think you're going to say some interesting things, but I would say in a mechanical term, it's like an XP track, actually.
Yeah, it's like an XP track. It gains you power.
You do things that mark corruption, and you fill up that corruption track, you get a new power, which is awesome.
Right.
And usually comes with the cost of marking more corruption.
Right, yeah.
When you do it, then
You
you're
keep
going to want to
doing
do it more.
Yeah.
And then players have this thing right around 80% of their tracks being filled, where they go,
Uh-oh.
I have made a terrible mistake. And they try to put the brakes on.
So here's what makes you mark corruption the first time. Like, what's the move that makes you mark corruption?
Oh, there's a general move called Let It Out. That if you are tapping your supernatural or superhuman powers, there is a chance for you to mark corruption, but it's not guaranteed.
Right, but that's usually how it starts,
Yeah.
right? Like, you're embracing your supernatural side, and you're rejecting sort of the natural human order, so to speak. I think that and like that is what starts you down this corruption track. What Urban Shadows says is, corruption is powerful, right? You start going down that track, you become a better vampire, you become a better werewolf, you become like, your psychic powers grow, right? So what it's saying about evil in that system is, it's connected to power, and like, it's very easy to take a little taste of it, but once you start going down that path, you're going to continue to go down. Again, that's a statement about how people, interact with each other and how they see themselves. So those are two examples I wanted to bring up before we jumped in. How much time do I have left, Ron? I'm Great. So let's take a second and let's create at least a scenario based on a moral statement. So I'm going to just say, I'm going to come up with a moral statement just so we're not running around in circles. I'm going to say that morality, Ron, you can take this down. Morality is what promotes life and liberty. Pretty inoffensive, seems like. But wait. So let's just have a quick discussion. Who would like to do a fantasy game that is based in a recognizable society, like a modern day fantasy or like a shadowy, like urban fantasy? Like who would want to do that? Raise your hands. Okay, who wants to do more of a distant fantasy, like swords and magic and things like that? Okay, looks like the swords and magic have. So this is a world where what is good is what promotes life and liberty. In this world, are prisons good? It's a simple answer, guys. No, prisons are not good. So that doesn't mean there aren't any, but it means that when you see them, you should see them as a place of moral compromise. Prisons are not good. In this world, is murder good? This one's easy. No, murder is not good. In fantasy, what we have is bad things are manifested so that we can fight them directly instead of fighting them in ways where we have to compromise ourselves, rationalize, or create justifications. So what is an example of a bad guy in this world that would compromise life or liberty? Any ideas?
Slaver.
A slaver. Great. Bad guy, the slaver. Yeah, so the slaver is bad because he cuts down, he reduces people's liberties, right? Let's talk about the slaver a little bit. What is his idea? Why does he do it? Why is he a slaver? Is it for money, for religion? Like what's the thing that motivates him to?
I would say that initially it'd be money. He got
Initially
lured
it's
into
money.
this month through money.
Great, so initially it was money, and did it change at some point? Is he now?
He may become, see it as a way of promoting a master race. and
I
enslaving
see.
the others.
I see. So he, like, now he sees himself as a hero, right? Okay, cool. That's great. Like, the bad guy is out there doing the slaving, and obviously our good heroes are going to stop them. What are some of the traits that the heroes in this story might have in terms of their background? What kinds of backgrounds do heroes who promote life and liberty come from? Jim?
Like an escaped slave.
An escaped slave, great. Very simple. Just take the other side of who our bad guy is. I've got one. How about a farmer? Right? Farmers cultivate life. That's their thing, right? Like, that's what they do. So when you talk about the farmer that rises to become a hero, that's this.
The farmer is fabulously conflicted, because of course it's farmers that benefit the most from slaves.
The farmer, yeah, maybe there are other farmers that are his, like, he sees directly the effects of slavery and he knows that it's wrong, right? That's great, that's good. Farmer's good. Any other,
Someone who was working with the bad guy in the beginning, perhaps seeing it as a way to earn coin, and then the person sees that it's gone too far. They hit their limit.
I see.
On morals.
So, in other words, someone who might not have cared either for life or liberty, and then, like, recognized the importance of it. Interesting. Okay, that's good. How about, let's go back just to the core of life and liberty, not someone that switched sides, but, like, what is a occupation or talent or something that reflects that? Go ahead.
I was gonna say that one more too would be, a person would be someone who is of the race that the slaver is promoting, but has had good experience with the oppressed races,
Right. Okay.
and sees it as horribly wrong.
Okay, so someone who is able to see the benefit, maybe they have a view of liberty where it's like, well, liberty's good because it lets everybody self-actualize and work together.
It's not just for one group.
It's not, yeah, exactly, great.
Revolutionary freedom fighter.
Revolutionary freedom fighter, right? He values liberty even above life, right? So it's like, I will lay my life on the line in a revolutionary war to protect people's rights.
Healer or doctor.
Healer or doctor, right? Preserves life, absolutely. And of course, this is a world with magic. What if there are druids or like people who are in tune with the natural world in some way, right? Those folks are connected to the circle of life and so on. Great, so this is like what is an example? So we have our bad guy, we have like our collection of farmers, freedom fighters, and healers. What's an example of something that, a scenario within this world, right, that our heroes could come across that puts their morality on the line?
One would be is that if there's a kingdom where slavery is technically legal, but they see it as this is terribly wrong. How do they approach that?
Okay, so I'm looking for an even more specific scenario.
Prison break. How about a rescue op?
A rescue op. Who are they rescuing?
Slaves, man.
All right, yeah, some guy, and who in particular, like, has been enslaved that, like, they are targeting to rescue?
Family members.
The farmer's daughter. Great, yeah, sure. The connection of life. That's great.
Like the healer's mentor.
The healer's mentor, who taught me to, heal people and to do surgeries or whatever. Yeah, great. I love it. So those are examples of good rescue targets that put it on the line. Here's another idea. I heard someone say escape. So what if a criminal escapes from prison, right? Like someone who actually is a dastardly criminal, and they escape from prison. We know that the prisons are run in this society by the scum of the earth, right? Maybe they have torture, maybe they have, bad, conditions. He escapes and the authorities are out looking for him. Right now, the question of the hero's devotion to liberty, may come up against their, a willingness to be law-abiding. So do they hide the criminal from the authorities and so on?
Well, that'd be like the Captain Blood thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where he heals an escaped rebel.
Right, right. These are all examples, and as you can see, like, once you kind of have these ideas of life and liberty in mind, you can then, like, expand them further, right? So if someone, for example, embraces animal rights, in this world, are animals, you know, some part of that web of life that need to be protected, or are they a resource that can be exploited? Guess what that is? That's a political statement, right? Who and what are entitled to these protections is a political statement. I think that's just about my time. So that's our example of using morality in fantasy world. I want to encourage you to think about what the moral structures of your fantasy world are. I'm not going to talk about alignment. But really,
We're never going to talk about it.
never going to talk about alignment. You can talk to me later if you want to talk about alignment. I actually have. There's some good things about alignment, but it would not.
Not many.
Like to pull them out of the dung heap would be very difficult. So you can talk to me about it later if you're interested. Yeah.
Just to, based on what we did there, just one thing about if you're looking for life and liberty, the question is, are laws good?
Yeah. That's a good
In
one.
general, are
Right?
laws
Laws
good?
might restrict your liberty.
Yeah.
They, you know, is there some restriction on one person's liberty that's justified in order to protect another one's or to protect someone's life? Yeah, absolutely. All good questions. So I would encourage you to think about the moral structures of your fantasy games. Remember that let people have that win in fantasy that they can't get in real life. And third, don't be afraid to take a political stand with the fantasy that you create, because you're going to when you portray that work. That's it. That's all I have.
Okay, so we're about to get to our first-time local jam speaker. Well done, sir. One thing, I do want the ability to kind of have some open discussion at the end. We'll try to do that depending on, you know, how the talks go. We sometimes have time, sometimes we don't. But I'd love to, at the end, if we have time, bring kind of everybody that spoke down and kind of have a Q&A session. We'll see how it goes. So our next speaker is my party's wizard, as far as getting some stuff taken care of. I recently started a podcast on Anchor, and I found out that they don't provide you with an RSS feed. And Peter said, that's bullshit, and went and found it in their feeds and information, and published it for me so I would be able to give people an RSS feed, so they could treat it like a real big boy podcast instead of an Anchor podcast. Yay. Anyway, Peter is going to be talking about Session 0, some goals and best practices that you might have in your Session 0. So give it up for Peter.
All right, so this is, I'm just going to talk about how I kind of put these things together, but real quick, Ron, thank you for inviting me to speak, and I've been coming to this for the 3 years that I've been coming to this con, and this is the most people I've seen for the Jams Conference, so this is awesome. So I want to talk, who here is familiar with Session 0, like what it is? Awesome, that's a whole lot more than I was expecting. So I do it a little bit differently because I really try to focus on, I want to have an epic freaking story with all my players. I want to make sure that they all have some kind of buy-in, some kind of hook, something that gets them into the story. You know, you were talking about, you know, threats and treats and all that stuff. This is kind of how I do that, but it gives me a lot of things to play with. And I meant to bring my prop deck with me and forgot. So I have a digital version that I can kind of show you guys, but so we know what Session 0 is. We all sit down with our players. I, as the GM, have an idea of what I want to run for, you know, plot-wise, and I kind of pitch that storyline to my players. And then we kind of figure out who fits into that story. Who are the people that we have that are there? So pretty straightforward. Everybody is already familiar with that. So, but that's what we were really doing. We're creating a cohesive party. and it just makes it easier on GMs if you have a cohesive party and you don't have that one jackass that wants to go off and take, for, you know, to put it in Savage World terms, they want to go take the arrogant and the mean hindrance and then just go and beat the living crap out of everybody when they're supposed to have like some vested interest in, like, you know, keeping their town going. I've had that player. He's not in the game anymore. So there isn't any one way of doing this. This is my way, and my players really like this one. We've had a ton of fun with it, and we've come up with some just really cool backgrounds. So the pitch, you know, that's on me. So I come to my players and I say, hey, this is my story. This is what I want to do. So right now, I'm very heavily steeped in Savage Rifts. And initially, we did, I design my campaigns a lot like TV shows, so I do seasons, I do episodes, seasons anywhere from 10 to 15, usually most of mine end up being around a dozen episodes, so individual sessions. And the first one we did, is everyone kind of familiar with Rifts in some way? Maybe? Alright, so there's this big war between magic, the kingdom of magic and the kingdom of humans, a technological superpower, and they go to war. So the first one, we kind of talked about that. That's what we wanted to play. We were going to play out that entire war, so we did that over the course of 4 seasons. Now, I'm actually doing something a little bit different, and there's going to be a total of 5 arcs in here, and we're doing the rise, the origin of the 4 horsemen. And we're about to start the 3rd, so in a couple of weeks, we're going to actually sit down and do our session 0 for that. But each campaign, so the first 4 campaigns, all have different, the players each come up with a new character for each campaign, and then the 5th campaign, we're going to like bring all 4 of those campaigns together, and they're going to have access to all of those characters. So that one's been a little bit interesting, but we talked about like what is the summary of that story. We're going to do the 4 horsemen. We're going to do the Tolkien War. We're going to do demons invading. Like whatever that is, that's the pitch. Just what are we doing so they have at least an idea of when they build their character what they're probably going to be up against, just to give them a little bit of something to work with. There's also the themes. I like just huge stories, just world-changing stories. I don't like doing necessarily a lot of little things. I don't do a lot with political diplomacy necessarily. It's there, but it hasn't really been a huge part of a lot of my games. That's something that we've discussed, and now it's started coming more and more into it because I have a group of players that likes trying to figure it out and figure it out with me. So that's what we talk about in the pitch. So the cast, and this is where I try to do something a little bit different. We just get a concept, and I tell the players, I'm like, don't come with a filled out character sheet. Hey, I'm gonna make you tear it up, I'll erase it, like just don't do it. Like we will come up with everything there, because if you come up with something in isolation, it may not necessarily fit the campaign. But we just start with, we go around the table and we say, what are your concepts? And clockwise around, talk to everybody, and that way we kind of figure out, okay, does everybody want to play the face character? Sometimes we end up with, like, we had, I think, combat and heal and hacking, and then another combat, and I'm like, so who's making the deals? They're like, oh, crap.
This is a super common situation, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Who's a merchant diplomat?
Yeah.
Persuasion. Cool.
Exactly. So, but we ended up with, you know, they shifted some things around. We ended up with the most recent one, we did a more cyberpunk style campaign, so it was very urban. And we ended up having this like super crazy good hacker who was also the group space, which was kind of entertaining. And so this part is what lets them kind of figure out their roles. And so then we have the story. And what I do is, a couple of years ago, there was a Kickstarter for background decks. And the background decks, they're really simple, a couple different genres. So there's a modern sci-fi, and then there's a fantasy and horror. And then each card has different plot hooks. So there's foe, friend, flame, and family are the three different general categories. And then you have these four plot points, but they're all within different subgenres. So what I started doing is I deal each person, each player a couple of cards, anywhere from 2 to 4. And then I'd say, pick 2 points, just 2. Sometimes I'll do 3, and 2 has worked out a little bit better. But pick two of these background pieces and that have to do with your character's history. And it's come up with some players take it pretty seriously, others they have that crazy family member somewhere along the line, and it gets a little odd. Usually they come up with something that just gives me a hook. And I'm like, all right, now what can I do with that? And so they pick their hooks, and then it's just kind of an interview process. Like we go back and forth and say, okay, well, you have this guy that I'm actually gonna pull up my deck so that I have an example to look at. So you have this enemy in the back, in your past. Why is he your enemy? Like, what did you do? What did he do to you? And
You flew in on a spaceship and you were a baby and you made no fault.
Just let it go.
That's from Guardians of the Galaxy 2.
So here, for instance, I have a friend card up on my screen, and I'm going to go with this gritty fantasy one. So I have a friend who's a saddle maker who has contracts with a lot of knights and nobles. Okay. So how do you know this guy? Oh, well, we grew up together. So there's this back and forth, and we can take that one sentence, and I'll usually end up with just a bunch of bullet points about like who this person is. But it's a lot of information from just like one single sentence that they picked for their character, and it gives me a lot of story fodder. Sometimes I use it to mess with them because GM. But a lot of times, like it leads to interesting connections, even just throughout. We've had several times in the last campaign where it just like grew into this network of contacts that they had around town and different safe houses and where they ended up. So that's for me the most important part, is to get those story hooks so that I have them and can use them against or to help, or usually against my players. The important part with that, though, is like you went through the effort of getting this information, you gotta use it. And so what I started doing, and I try to use at least one from every single player. I try. Sometimes they don't give me enough information. I've had some players be really resistant to providing information that they know could potentially lead to some kind of conflict down the road. Most of the time they're really good about it, and so I'm able to like pull one from every single player. If I can, I want to use all of them over time. But with what we've been doing, where each character is like in there for a season, then we just haven't had the time to pull in all of them, but there's still some opportunity. And then like from there, it's rule number 1, like have fun. That's it. Like that's my process.
Thank you, Peter. Let us get on and move along to the next speaker. This guy is a local game master. He is also a special guest here at this convention, probably for his work on Torg Eternity, maybe.
Me.
Oh, shit, it's me. and he works for Ulisses North America. He is going to be talking about, by the way, developer of Torg Eternity. He's going to be talking about Chasing Personal Dragons, which was his ham-fisted attempt at staying in the cons theme. Character faults.
It's important to me, that's my fault.
Ladies and gentlemen, Darrell Hayhurst. Oh, you have a thing?
What?
You don't have a thing, right?
No.
All right, just making sure. No
No,
thing.
I like to keep it fast.
All right.
Yeah, so Chasing Personal Dragons, like Ron said, was kind of like my jokey way to try and stay in theme, but I think character faults are super important. But the hard part was making the leap, because generally when you're talking about the disadvantages for characters, you're thinking, this is a player discussion. This is a player discussion. This is something that would be leaning more towards what we would be doing at that session 0, for each person individually. And this is a GM conference, so what the hell are you talking about? So, a little bit of preamble on this. What I got started in gaming was a game called Champions. And what you want the prototype game for adding disadvantages to characters in Champions, because it required that you had like 10 of them. Like, kryptonite was going to kill you, you were going to go berserk if you were insulted, you had a secret identity. Every single hero in the Avengers brings an Aunt May, to the base. I mean, you have to. It is absolutely built in to the DNA of the game, and it became built into my DNA as a gamer. And a lot of games lean into this idea, of these disadvantages. I'm also a lazy GM. And one of the things that you learn in GMing Champions is these are almost all useless. Because if everyone's hunted by Viper on 14 or less, well, okay, we fight Viper every session. I don't want to fight Viper this session, so I'm ignoring these disadvantages, so what do? They don't do anything. That's on me as a GM, right? There's going to be negotiation GM to player on this stuff, but on the GM side, we do have a job when players take disadvantages or hindrances in Savage Worlds, or trouble in Fate. And trouble in Fate is pretty much like the most important one, because it's the entire, foundation of the economy of the game, and if you're ignoring it as a game master, you're not playing Fate. Like, the game breaks if you don't. And that puts a lot of pressure on you as the GM to interface with this. And one of the other pieces of pressure that comes from this, players are choosing, hopefully, their faults very carefully, because they're the stories that player wants to tell. Like, as a player, I'm not choosing a disadvantage to ignore it. I'm choosing a disadvantage to interface with it during the game. I want it to matter. I want it to come up. It's load bearing. When people see like that hero or whatever, they go, oh yeah, he goes berserk if someone kills somebody. That's important. Like, that tells me something about him, who he is. And if that never comes up, it's useless. So as a GM, part of this is going to be on the player. Like, hey, find ways to bring that to the surface, so your allies at the table and your GM know, like, this is a thing that's important, that's going to have impact. But it's also on the GM to create those situations where that is going to come into play. So, as a lazy GM, I pick one disadvantage per character per game session. And that's the one that I'm going to make sure, okay, this session, somehow I'm going to do something with this you notice in most game sessions, everyone's setting up at least 3. Like 3 is a magic number, everyone's got 3. I got news for you, they're not all 3 ever going to come up and play. Again, in Fate, you've got 5, and that you can turn either way. And you lose track. You know, as a GM, there's just no way you're going to be able to push those. So I picked 1, and I strongly urge, you know, for my players, pick 1 that you want to emphasize this session. Maybe it's the same one every time, and that becomes a pillar of the character. Maybe it's a different one, so you've got more texture to play with. But the more you pick 1, the stronger that character comes out in relief. So it's a technique for them, and it also helps you as a lazy GM find dilemmas. You know, I call them dilemmas. You want to push this disadvantage, like the code versus killing is a very common. And if we were doing this as a discussion, I'd be like, hey, pick a hindrance or a trouble or whatever, and we would like workshop. What do you do with this? Like, as a GM, how do you play with this in a positive way? Because most times when you're interacting with these disadvantages, they're going to halt play. They're disadvantaged because it harms the character in some way. And that's why you kind of want to ignore it. You're like, I want to move on. Like, I want to get to the cool stuff. And your job as a GM is to make sure that fault is the cool stuff. That disadvantage is bringing something to the story in and of itself, rather than becoming this kind of painful side story that we just blew 5 minutes on. It's like, cool, you got your spotlight out of this. Like we all got a moment with this character, and that's neat. And if we do that with all 5 characters, that's like a half an hour that was all side stuff. It may be cool, maybe not. Can we use this to push the story forward? And one of the examples I've got for that is greedy. So, that could be in a D&D world or whatever. And since a lot of us come from the primordial ooze of Dungeons and Dragons, when you think of greedy, you think, oh, it's the rogue. And what's the rogue do? Like, he's stealing gold from other player characters. And it's like, well, okay, that told us something about the rogue. We have learned something about him. He's kind of a D-bag, and we don't like him. And if it keeps happening, this is a problem for the table, right? Because people are like, all right, I want to catch him. And if I catch him, it's kind of over. We're going to have a fight or something, and now this game's gone off the rails, and we're not getting a story. So that sort of disadvantage, that personality quirk, is becoming a negative in that situation. It doesn't have to be, because you as a GM can use it as a positive. If you know, like, all right, Darrell wants to be a greedy rogue, he's kind of being a D-bag about it. How do we work this in a positive way? You can make these motivators. So greed, if you're picking that one and saying, all right, greed is load bearing for this rogue. We want to establish that he's greedy. We've got a job, and it's a sucky one that we wouldn't do, but she's rich. Yeah. And suddenly greed is like, okay, now that's pushing us onto the adventure that we maybe wouldn't have done, except the greedy rogue really wants that treasure. It's like, no, there's money in this, guys. Big gold. They're like, we're gonna have to like blow up the space station or fight a dragon or whatever. Like, what are you talking about? It's like, she's rich. She's rich. So every one of these can be a positive or a negative, and there's like a million variations of this. But when you pick the one that you want to emphasize in the session, you got to think through what are the negative ways that this could happen, and often you're picking it because those negative ones have come up, and you want to train them to the more positive side, without changing who the character is. It's like, hey, we can push this game in this direction without having to pull up, retcon the character, completely take them out. Yeah.
You might like a backstop to that, so that if the characters find out that this guy is stealing from the rest of them, that there's a reason he's doing that more than just simply he wants money. He has a reason for that money, and that may actually be a unifying thing.
Exactly, like, and that's all like the consequence.
That's putting a backstop out there.
And that's the thing about disadvantages and why they're so attractive is because they create story.
Yeah.
Like, and you know, we all love story in games, and that's why even in games that mechanically don't offer you any reward for a disadvantage at all, you still end up, characters have them, right? And not every player is gonna do this, but a lot of them do. Like they'll self-limit and do that because they want to tell a story. And half the story is overcoming your personal dragon, your trouble, or at least using it to give you something to grab onto or put. Like in convention games, if you hand me a piece of paper that's just got powers on it, it's like, okay, I can maybe do something with that. I'm a creative guy, I do this for a living, why not? But it's so much better, it's like, okay, yeah, here's my powers, da, 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 da. And then here's like this one stupid factoid that's like, oh yeah, and you know, you're curious. Okay, maybe I can do something with that. You know, and there's so it's something as a GM we can't ignore. And one of the other things as a GM, so we're arbiters of rules, and a lot of these come with mechanical weight on them. Well, you've got this disadvantage, you must do this, or you must not, you know, do this thing, or you know, it's going to do that. I used to be super strict about this. Like I used to be like no, this is the game. You have to follow this rule. And over time, I have softened my stance significantly because one of the things I've also discovered is not everyone wants to tell that story. And so if a game requires you to take trouble and disadvantages, but the player really doesn't want to deal with it, don't make them. Pick someone else's story. If you're pretty much only doing one of those a session, just don't do that one. Or it's like, oh man, it says on here I'm a coward, but I just don't want to play that. Okay, don't. This is about having fun, right? Now, that would be a conversation that I would have with the player later, like, all right, you should probably switch out coward for something else. You know, because usually there's a benefit that comes with the disadvantage too. You know, like whether it's explicit or not. You know, like, oh, I've got a hindrance in Savage Worlds, and you know, I've got this cowardice thing, and a firefight breaks out, and I'm like, yeah, I'm headed for the hills. What? You just got out of the fight? Yeah, but good job. You get a Benny for that. Right? You left everyone hanging. And they're gonna have words with you, you know, if they survive this.
You're not the most popular character, yeah.
Right? Yeah, there's gonna be fallout for that. Hey, that actually made what could have been a very rote fight suddenly super interesting because like, well, yeah, somebody took a wound, someone got hurt during that. I'm gonna give you a Benny because there's gonna be some serious discussion, you know, with the party after this on how this works. And that's cool. Like that's the kind of thing that gives you a hook and then we can play into. And if you are like, okay, I've done that and I don't really want to do it anymore, most game systems offer you the option to mechanically buy that off. Or you, as a GM, are just like, all right, let's just trade this around. Like I think that's usually easier because you still want to have those things there and say, all right, yeah, you've overcome your cowardice. That's going to be a cool story. And it's a story that you see in all sorts of media, you know, like the coward like finally turns around and says, no, this time I'm helping out. I draw my gun and I get in there. And that's a great moment. Now, you know, you lost an eye doing that. That's how this works. And so you just swap them out. And that's, you know, that works fine. But I won't push someone. They don't want to do that story. And they're like, look, I took this because I had to. missing out. Oh, you're not playing. Bummer. And then, as a lazy GM, part of the other thing that I've tried to do with this is push as much of the overhead, the operational overhead dealing with disadvantages onto the players as a whole. And this is something I think Fate does really well with self-compel, which sometimes you're like, oh yeah, I just did this by instinct. You should get your Fate point, even though the GM didn't specifically hose you. It's like, I kind of hosed myself for you. Is that good?
That's a good team player there.
You just got to get into the mindset to remember to like have that conversation and get the Fate point for it.
Yeah.
I think when it is natural, it is amazing when the rest of the table does that too. You're like, oh, we've played up that your character's curious, and we're like searching the cave or whatever, and
The catchphrase my group uses, oh, that's our Darrell.
yeah, right, yeah, exactly. That's our Darrell,
There
right?
he goes.
And that's what you want in a character.
Yeah.
You really want that. Like the best experience I've had as a player was when one of my characters showed up as an NPC in somebody else's game, and the GM nailed it. And I was like, yes! They're playing the disadvantages and everything, but that felt like my character, and I was like, I did that. I had some part of that. This is something everyone should be able to experience. It's what makes the character a separate entity in many ways. And then it's like, yeah, that's our Darrell. So like, yeah, you're in a cave, and everyone knows that Darrell's got the curiosity, drawback or whatever. GM is not thinking of this, right? The GM is really focused on, oh man, there's a monster, down the left, da 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 da. Player is not even thinking about this. He's just like, oh man, there's a clue going on. Tracy is sitting there going, wouldn't it be really funny if like Darrell, because he's curious, like saw a sparkle and went off down the right, a different path, and got separated from the rest of us. And the whole table goes, oh yeah. Yeah, that would be pretty funny. And then that's a best case scenario, and some of that can be offloaded on the player group. But to get there, you have to establish it, and part of that's GM. You've got to do that. You've got to put that front and center and train the player to have that fault or disadvantage up there. And that's why I picked one. Mostly people remember one, and the other ones are just fallbacks, or they're plan B. If the one that you picked just isn't working out, you're like, yeah, turns out cowardice kind of sucked. Like, I don't want to do that. And the last kind of piece that I wanted of this puzzle is, and this is also where it comes into GMs, this is not just a player thing. Non-player characters, they've got disadvantages too, and those are hooks. When a bad guy is greedy, why can't you bribe him? Half the interesting part of the players, just one of the things that we complain about as GMs is like, oh man, all my characters ever do is go in and hit the orc with a sword, and they don't care. Like, well, who is that orc, right? If that orc is greedy, that gives them a hook. They know, wait, I've got an option other than hitting them with a sword.
And that's where the face can take them out.
Exactly. Like, I've got 2 gold pieces. Is that going to be enough? And then suddenly you've got a completely different paradigm. And so, and part of the gag is communicating those disadvantages to the players. How do they find out that they're there? Some games have that built in, like empathy and fate. Like, that's its superpower, is I get to look at that guy and analyze him and tell what his most interesting trouble hook is, and then the player characters can use that. That can be an agnostic mechanic. That could work on any game, and it's something you should think about. And also, as a GM, because you're setting these, you kind of, like, you can build in some ways to use that hook. And if you're like, oh cool, and I want to make him this, but there's nothing they can do with it, think again. I mean, players are creative, they'll figure out something, but if you're building it without any ideas on how it might be used, you might not get much mileage out of it. So, that's me talking in circles around character disadvantages and why GMs should care and interface with it.
Dragons are good, okay? All right. Thank you, Darrell. That was awesome. Up next, we've got a kind of a veteran of the GM's conference, local GM. I have an over-under on how long it takes for the Apocalypse World engine to come up during his talk. I'm not telling you.
You're over, sorry, you're over.
You're so funny. I'm just messing with you. In case you could not tell by the banter, Brian Poe is up next, folks. Let me get you set up.
You're way over.
You don't know.
Yeah, you do.
Oh yeah, I do, don't I? You know too. All right, it's coming up over here. I don't, so I'm just gonna have to press that button right there. I spent all my money on games, dude.
Yeah, no, I get it.
Come on. There it is. What? I know. It's warming up. All right.
I'm gonna try really hard to stand it the last time I did this.
All the time. Oh, good job, dude.
I heard it now.
I'm just kidding. All right, you just press that button.
Okay.
All right.
What's not here?
That's your microphone. Brian Poe, everybody.
Yeah. Okay. My discussion is going to be about how to hear your players and how to make them learn to talk to you. And my subtitle is a quantum GM discussion. So there's a million kinds of GMs, but I am a binary person, so there's two kinds of GMs. There are those GMs that plan everything out, that put a lot of work, front-end work, and you guys are amazing, and you guys do things that I can't do because I can't sit down by myself and work something out like that. I just don't have the attention span to do that, so I'm never going to be that GM. And so, yeah, it's okay. It's my fault, and that's okay. So that being said, I'm going to be talking to other GMs or people who want to do it possibly a different way. If you, like me, when I started running games, I would want to plan out these things and they wouldn't work, or I'd feel like I was just driving players on a rail and it didn't help anyone, and everyone felt frustrated, and I felt frustrated because I wanted these grand things that just didn't happen. And so I have learned over the last few years to be a better GM by not planning everything out and allowing things to happen dynamically. And so a quantum GM, I'm defining as a GM that uses uses the quantum idea that if it's not observed by either me or the players, then we don't know what it is, and we don't have to define it until it comes up, because that allows for more opportunities. And how to do that well is a very, very difficult thing to do. But I really want to help you guys get there, because it's a really rewarding experience. So what is a quantum GM? So armchair physics clearly states that something is in a quantum state is unknown, and during this time anything is possible until it's observed, right? Like a deck of cards, any card could be on top of that deck, right? Any card. It could be the Ace of Spades, or it could be a Forest for Magic the Gathering. You don't know it. It is unknown. And so because we do not know what that is, it is okay that we don't have that, right? We don't have that knowledge, and we can use that to be flexible. So a quantum GM will allow any other things to be unknown until it's observed by the players or the GM. Now, the GM observing things does take it out of that quantum state. So if I say that they're in my mind, right? I say, hey, there's this force that is doing this thing. This evil is sending a spy, and that spy is coming into this castle, and he is looking for these things. I said that in my mind. That needs to be true forever, because that was the motivation for that spy coming into this castle. Later on, just because the players have not seen that yet, that doesn't mean that it's not observed, right? If you don't, that will make your games inconsistent. And anyone who has problems with like this type of GMing, like generally has problems with this type of problem that crops up, because well, you can be fucking doing anything. There's nothing consistent about your world. It seemed like he was a spy, and then all of a sudden he wasn't. He was my best friend, right? And so, like, yeah, you need to be internally consistent to yourself and your prep, as well as what the players see. And so that requires a lot of faith on everything. So it requires a couple things. It requires less prep, which is nice, but it requires like rapid creativity, which is hard and requires a lot of practice. So when you do this, it's gonna suck the first few times. The first game that I ran like this was god awful. It was so bad. I also did it with like 8 people, and everyone was so it was awful. So this is a contrast to you GMs who plan out everything. It's not the way, but I want to like help people get there in the end. So a couple truths.